What if the charity you trusted most was never really about charity at all? Sit with that for a second, because the most dangerous scandals don't begin with sirens, headlines, or courtroom sketches. They begin quietly, politely, with applause, with carefully worded mission statements, with donation links that promise hope, justice, and change, all wrapped in glossy photos and powerful names. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And that's where this story starts. Not with an arrest, not with a raid, not even with missing money. It starts with belief. Belief is powerful. Belief makes people stop asking questions. Belief convinces donors that transparency is implied, not required. Belief allows a charity to grow faster than its paperwork, faster than its oversight, faster than its accountability. And once belief takes over, the numbers can do almost anything. Picture this: a foundation launch streamed live, smiling faces, a carefully curated message about compassion and impact, a promise that this organization will do things differently. Donations pour in. Small ones, large ones, corporate pledges, speaking fees redirected, partnerships announced. The brand grows, the language grows, the confidence grows. But somewhere between the applause and the spreadsheets, something subtle shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to matter. Here's the uncomfortable question most people never ask until it's too late. How many charities are built to look transparent rather than actually be transparent? Because transparency isn't about posting photos of good deeds. It's about documentation. Boring documentation. Tedious documentation. The kind no one applauds. And that's exactly why problems hide there. This story matters now because trust is wearing thin. Donors are tired, causes are endless, and celebrity-driven philanthropy has blurred the line between impact and image so thoroughly that many people no longer know where one ends and the other begins. You've probably felt it too. That slight hesitation before donating. That quiet question in the back of your mind, where does this actually go? That moment you scroll past the impact report because it feels more like marketing than math. Now imagine being inside that organization. Emails, meetings, internal documents, a growing pressure to perform generosity publicly while privately scrambling to keep systems in place. Because charities don't collapse from greed alone. They collapse from shortcuts, from assumptions, from the belief that good intentions can substitute for good governance. And here's where the story takes its first sharp turn. The foundation at the center of this docudrama wasn't struggling, it wasn't failing. It wasn't underfunded, it was thriving. Millions raised in record time. Media praise, high-profile supporters, everything looked right. Which raises the most dangerous question of all. If everything looked right, why did one accountant quietly flag a single line item and refuse to sign off? No press release mentioned it, no donor email referenced it, no social post acknowledged it. But behind the scenes, that line item became a problem. At first, it seemed harmless, a classification issue, a timing discrepancy, the kind of thing nonprofits adjust all the time. Except this, one didn't resolve. Weeks passed, then months. The number stayed. The explanation changed. And that's when belief started cracking. Here's the irony no one likes to talk about. The bigger the charity brand, the harder it becomes for internal voices to speak up. Questioning the numbers starts to feel like questioning the mission. Questioning the mission starts to feel like betrayal. So people hesitate. They rewrite emails. They soften language. They tell themselves, it'll be fixed next quarter. But next quarter never comes. Instead, more money arrives. Donors don't see the internal stress. They see polished announcements. They see photos from events. They hear phrases like ongoing initiatives and strategic partners, and they trust. This is where the story shifts from uncomfortable to dangerous. Because once money starts moving faster than oversight, accountability becomes optional unless someone forces it to be mandatory. And someone did. Not a journalist, not a rival, not an activist, a compliance specialist. Someone whose job was so unglamorous, most people inside the organization barely noticed them. Someone whose inbox filled with forms, deadlines, and reminders no one liked reading, until one reminder went unanswered. Then another. Then an entire filing cycle passed without resolution. That's when silence stopped being neutral. Silence became a signal. And signals matter, especially to regulators, especially to auditors, especially to anyone trained to recognize when we're working on it, actually means we don't want to look at this too closely. Here's the part most donors never realize. Investigations don't begin with accusations, they begin with patterns. Missed deadlines, inconsistent explanations, documents that exist, but never quite line up. And once that pattern forms, it doesn't matter how inspiring the mission sounds. Math doesn't care about intentions. The Foundation's leadership continued forward, confident the issue was minor. Public-facing language remained optimistic. Internal meetings focused on growth, not correction. But behind closed doors, one phrase started appearing more often. Let's be careful how we phrase this. Careful language is often the first sign of panic, because when transparency is real, language doesn't need protecting. By now, you might be wondering, how much money are we talking about? At this stage, no one could say for sure. That uncertainty alone should have been enough to stop everything. It wasn't. And this is where the story stops being about accounting and starts being about human behavior. Egos, reputations, fear of embarrassment. Because once a charity becomes a symbol, admitting a mistake feels like attacking the symbol itself. So people delay, they negotiate definitions, they reframe categories, they hope scrutiny fades. But scrutiny doesn't fade, it waits. Quietly, patiently. And then one day, it arrives in the form of a request that can't be ignored. Not a threat, not an accusation, a request for clarification. Polite, formal, precise. The kind that signals someone outside the building is now paying attention. That's when the internal panic finally surfaced. Emergency meetings, legal consultations, draft statements that never get released. The belief that once protected the organization now worked against it, because belief had convinced everyone that the Foundation was untouchable. And untouchable systems are the ones that fall hardest. This is the moment where many scandals could still be stopped, where transparency could reset trust, where honesty could limit damage. But that requires something rare, admitting uncertainty before certainty is forced upon you. Instead, leadership chose confidence. They assured themselves the issue was technical, temporary, overblown. They underestimated one thing: persistence. Because the people asking questions weren't emotional, they weren't impressed by branding, they weren't invested in reputation, they were invested in documentation. And documentation doesn't lie. It just waits to be read. By the time the Foundation realized the scrutiny wasn't going away, the narrative was no longer theirs to control. And here's the chilling truth. Once control is lost, everything becomes evidence. Emails, meeting notes, drafts never meant to leave internal folders. Suddenly, the story isn't about good intentions anymore. It's about timelines, amounts, signatures, and whether belief was used as a shield rather than a mission. This introduction isn't about accusing anyone. It's about understanding how quickly trust can become vulnerability, and how easily a charity built on hope can stumble into a crisis built on numbers. Because what happened next didn't begin with accusations. It began with access. And once access was granted, there was no turning back. But the first real shock wasn't the money. It was who knew and when. And that revelation would change everything. How do you build a charity that no one dares to question? That's not a rhetorical flourish. It's the central mystery. Because long before spreadsheets were examined or emails were flagged, this foundation mastered something far more powerful than fundraising. It mastered perception. And perception, when done right, becomes armor. The image was flawless, a mission statement that sounded like it had been workshopped by hope itself. Language that balanced urgency with compassion. A logo that felt modern, serious, global. The kind of branding that quietly told donors, you're on the right side of history. And it worked. People didn't just donate, they believed. Belief is sticky. Belief fills in gaps. Belief forgives small inconsistencies because it assumes good intent. And when belief attaches to a cause, it stops behaving rationally. That's not an insult. That's human nature. The Foundation's public debut was everything a launch should be. Media coverage framed it as a new model for impact. Commentators praised its ambition. Supporters shared the announcement with captions like, "Finally," and "This is what leadership looks like." Behind the scenes, the team watched the numbers climb in real time. First thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then millions. It felt surreal, exhilarating, dangerous, because success arrived faster than infrastructure. Here's the contradiction no one wanted to say out loud. The foundation looked bigger than it actually was. The public assumed scale. Internally, scale was still theoretical. There were systems, yes, but they were lean, scrappy, built for growth that was supposed to be gradual, not explosive. When money moves faster than systems, people improvise. And improvisation in the nonprofit world is where problems are born. Meetings were upbeat, optimistic, full of phrases like, "We'll circle back and let's refine that later." No one wanted to be the person who slowed momentum with boring questions about compliance. After all, why rain on a parade that was raising millions for good? This is where the image did its quiet work. The foundation didn't just look legitimate, it looked untouchable. And untouchable organizations develop a subtle blind spot. They start assuming scrutiny is for others. Smaller charities, messier charities, organizations without polished leadership or media goodwill. This one felt different, special, protected. Staff members felt it, partners felt it. Donors definitely felt it. That protection wasn't stated, it was implied. It lived in the way emails were written, the confidence of public statements, the assumption that questions would be handled internally, discreetly, without disruption. Because disruption was the enemy. The image had to remain clean, and cleanliness, when prioritized above clarity, creates tension. At first, that tension was barely noticeable. A delayed report here, a reclassified expense there, a conversation postponed until after the next event. Each delay felt reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. But patterns only matter if someone is looking. And in the early days, no one was looking too closely. Why would they? Everything appeared to be working. The foundation posted impact updates that were inspiring but vague. Stories instead of statistics. Faces instead of figures. Narratives instead of numbers. That wasn't deception. It was marketing. And marketing, in the nonprofit world, is expected. Donors don't want to read audits. They want to feel something. The foundation understood that instinct perfectly. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The more emotionally compelling the story, the easier it is to hide behind it. Internal discussions focused on expansion, new initiatives, bigger partnerships, more visibility. Growth was the priority. Oversight was assumed. No one explicitly said compliance didn't matter. They just acted like it would take care of itself. That's the first real crack, because compliance doesn't take care of itself. It demands attention, discipline, unsexy labor, and the people responsible for that labor often have the least power. The foundation's compliance staff worked quietly, methodically, filing reminders, tracking deadlines, updating checklists. They were not part of the launch photos. They were not quoted in articles. They were rarely invited to strategy sessions. Their work wasn't celebrated. It was tolerated. Until it wasn't. As donations surged, the internal pressure increased. More transactions, more partners, more complexity. And complexity is where assumptions go to die. One afternoon, during what was supposed to be a routine review, a junior staffer noticed something odd. A mismatch. A category that didn't quite fit. It wasn't alarming, just confusing. They flagged it, asked a question, received a reassuring answer. It's being handled. Handled by whom? That wasn't clear. The staffer let it go. For now. This is how problems survive. Not through malice, but through politeness. No one wanted to be difficult. No one wanted to suggest incompetence. No one wanted to undermine the mission. The image demanded cooperation. The image demanded silence. As the foundation's public profile grew, so did internal compartmentalization. Financial conversations became smaller, more selective. Language grew cautious. Let's be mindful of optics. We don't want to confuse stakeholders. This will make more sense once everything is finalized. Finalized became a moving target. Weeks passed. Then months. The odd category remained. More money flowed through it. Still, no one panicked, because panic would imply something was wrong. And something being wrong felt incompatible with the image everyone had invested in. Here's the thing about images. Once people build their identities around them, protecting the image becomes self-protection. Admitting a flaw feels like self-sabotage. That's when rationalizations begin. It's temporary, it's technical, it's misunderstood. The foundation continued announcing wins, grants, partnerships, appearances. Externally, momentum was unstoppable. Internally, questions were stacking up. A compliance deadline came and went with incomplete documentation. Extensions were requested, granted. Another deadline approached, same result. This time, the compliance specialist hesitated before sending the reminder. They rewrote the email 3 times, softened the tone, removed any language that could be interpreted as alarmist, because no one wants to be the person who creates friction in a mission-driven space. But friction exists whether you acknowledge it or not. The email went out, the response came quickly. We're aware, we're working on it. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it raised a new question. Working on what exactly? The specialist asked for clarification. Silence. Not hostile silence, just busy silence. The kind that implies priority elsewhere. This is where the image began to backfire. The foundation's leadership was so accustomed to admiration that they underestimated accountability. They assumed goodwill would translate into patience. They were right until they weren't, because the people who monitor compliance don't operate on admiration. They operate on rules, and rules don't care how inspiring your mission sounds. As the foundation prepared for another major public moment, internal conversations shifted away from numbers entirely. Focus narrowed to messaging, talking points, media strategy. The image had to shine. Behind that shine, the unresolved issues sat quietly, waiting. The compliance specialist made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not a rebellious one, a procedural one. They documented the delays, they logged the inconsistencies, they did their job, and in doing so, they created a record. Records are dangerous things when stories start unraveling. At this point, no one was accusing anyone of wrongdoing. There was no scandal, no investigation, no crisis, just documentation. But documentation has a way of becoming a narrative when reviewed later, and later was approaching. The foundation received a formal request for additional information, neutral in tone, standard language, a request that happens to many organizations every year. Except this, one landed differently, because suddenly the internal questions had an external echo. The request wasn't accusatory, but it was precise. Specific dates, specific categories, specific amounts. The image could no longer answer those questions on its own. This was the moment the foundation could have paused, reset, clarified. Instead, it pushed forward. Leadership reassured the team. Public messaging continued uninterrupted. The request was framed internally as routine, nothing to worry about. Those words are rarely harmless. Because worry isn't the problem. Complacency is. The compliance specialist reviewed the request again and again. They noticed something unsettling. The categories referenced matched the odd line item that had been flagged months earlier. The one that never resolved. That's when the realization hit. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a convergence. Internal uncertainty had met external scrutiny, and the image, the very thing that built the foundation's power, was now blocking its ability to respond honestly. Because how do you admit confusion when your entire brand is built on confidence? How do you slow down when momentum is your identity? The perfect image had done its job too well. It convinced everyone that the foundation was beyond question. But questions don't disappear when ignored. They wait. And what came next wasn't loud, it wasn't public, it wasn't dramatic, it was a request for access. And once access is granted, the image no longer matters. Only the records do. And those records were about to tell a very different story. Where was the money actually meant to go? That question sounds simple, almost naive. But inside any large charity, it's the most dangerous question you can ask, because the answer lives at the intersection of intention, structure, and reality. And those three rarely align as neatly as the brochures suggest. The foundation's public-facing promise was clear. Every dollar had a purpose. Every contribution flowed toward impact. That clarity was the backbone of donor trust. Internally, though, money doesn't move in straight lines. It moves through accounts, classifications, temporary holds, restricted funds, unrestricted pools, reimbursements, grants in progress, administrative offsets. In theory, all of it balances. In practice, theory needs discipline to survive. At the beginning, the Foundation's financial map looked elegant. Donations entered a central account. From there, funds were allocated into program-specific buckets. Each bucket had a label. Each label had a purpose. Each purpose was documented. On paper, it was beautiful. And that's where the danger hid, because beauty on paper can seduce even the people responsible for verifying it. The Foundation's finance team worked with templates, standard nonprofit frameworks adapted for speed. Growth had outpaced customization, so they relied on structures meant for organizations half this size. No one thought that was reckless. It felt efficient. After all, the mission was noble, the leadership was respected, the scrutiny seemed distant. And early on, the numbers behaved. Small grants went out on time, vendor payments cleared, administrative expenses stayed within expected ranges. But as donations increased, complexity multiplied. Restricted funds arrived with conditions. Some donors specified timelines, others specified outcomes. A few required reports before release. Each restriction created a fork in the money's path. Those forks piled up. To manage them, the Foundation used internal classifications, categories that determined where money could go and how quickly it could move. This is where the first subtle shift occurred. One classification was created as a temporary holding space, a bridge, a neutral zone meant to exist briefly before funds were reassigned properly. It wasn't sinister, it wasn't hidden, it was practical. Temporary categories exist in every organization. The problem isn't their existence. The problem is when temporary becomes permanent. At first, funds passed through the category quickly. Days, weeks, then longer. No one panicked. They assumed delays were procedural, administrative, the kind of friction that accompanies rapid growth. Then, the category's balance grew. Not dramatically, quietly. The finance team noticed, but the explanation always sounded reasonable. Pending approvals, awaiting documentation, scheduling delays, each reason made sense on its own. Together, they formed a pattern no one wanted to see. The compliance specialist flagged it again, this time more formally. They asked for a timeline. When would the funds be fully allocated? The answer came back vague. Soon. Soon is the most dangerous word in governance. Because soon implies intention without commitment, and intention without deadlines drifts. Meanwhile, the Foundation continued announcing initiatives that implied those funds were already in motion. Language like supporting, partnering, investing. To the public, it sounded definitive. Internally, it was aspirational. This gap between language and reality widened. Here's where the emotional contradiction hit the staff hardest. They believed in the work. They wanted the impact to be real. They didn't want to slow momentum with technical concerns. So they rationalized. The money is earmarked. The projects are planned. The execution will catch up. Except execution requires decisions, and decisions require authority. And authority was fragmented. Different teams assumed different responsibilities. Finance assumed programs would finalize allocations. Programs assumed finance had already locked in distributions. Leadership assumed both sides were aligned. No one was intentionally negligent. They were collectively optimistic. And optimism is not a control mechanism. As the category balance climbed, it began to distort reporting. Not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to complicate explanations. When preparing internal summaries, the finance team adjusted language. They emphasized commitments over transfers, plans over payments. Again, this wasn't deception, it was framing. But framing, repeated often enough, becomes substitution. The compliance specialist noticed something else. Some funds entering the temporary category were no longer easily traceable to their original restrictions. The paper trail wasn't gone. It was diluted. Multiple donations pooled, multiple conditions layered. Untangling them would require time and attention the team didn't feel it had. They raised the issue. The response came back cautious. Let's not overcomplicate this. Overcomplication is another word people use when they feel pressure. But complexity doesn't disappear when ignored. It compounds. The Foundation's public calendar filled with appearances, announcements, partnerships. Each one reinforced the image of impact. Behind that image, the temporary category became a kind of financial limbo. Money wasn't missing, it just wasn't moving. And money that doesn't move raises questions, especially when it's publicly implied to be active. The compliance specialist escalated their concern. This time, the conversation changed tone. Leadership didn't dismiss the issue. They acknowledged it. They requested summaries. They asked for options. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it introduced fear. Because fear enters when people realize a problem might be visible. The summaries revealed the uncomfortable truth. A significant amount of money had passed through the temporary category and stayed there longer than acceptable. The longer it stayed, the harder it became to reassign cleanly. Not impossible, just messy. And messiness threatens image. Leadership debated next steps. Should they freeze announcements until allocations were finalized? That would slow momentum. Could they retroactively align reports? That risked scrutiny. The foundation faced a choice few organizations like to admit exists: pause and clarify, or proceed and explain later. They chose to proceed because pausing felt like failure. The compliance specialists documented everything. They didn't argue, they didn't protest, they recorded. Documentation isn't emotional, it's factual. Dates, amounts, conversations. Those records would matter later. As the foundation prepared its annual filings, the temporary category became unavoidable. It had to be addressed. The finance team proposed a solution: reclassify the funds into a broader administrative bucket, then redistribute gradually. Technically allowable, logistically efficient, but it blurred donor intent. The compliance specialist objected. They cited guidelines, restrictions, best practices. The response was measured. We'll note it. Let's keep moving. Keep moving. Momentum had become doctrine. The filings went out. They were not fraudulent. They were incomplete. And incompleteness is the most dangerous state of all, because it invites questions without providing answers. Those questions arrived quietly. Requests for clarification, follow-ups, requests for supplemental documentation. The foundation responded promptly, professionally, confidently, but each response required more explanation than the last. The narrative became harder to maintain. Internally, stress rose. Staff began asking each other questions in hushed tones, not accusations. Curiosity tinged with anxiety. Do you understand how that works? Is this normal? Have we cleared that yet? No one had a definitive answer. That uncertainty spread. Leadership scheduled meetings to address morale. They emphasized mission. They reassured staff that everything was under control. But reassurance doesn't resolve ambiguity. It just delays confrontation. The compliance specialist received another request, this one more specific. It referenced the temporary category directly. It asked for a breakdown, not estimates, not summaries. A breakdown. This was no longer routine. This was targeted. And targeted requests mean someone has already seen enough to ask precise questions. The finance team scrambled. They pulled records, cross-referenced transactions, tried to reconstruct timelines that had never been finalized. What they found wasn't a smoking gun. It was worse. It was confusion, overlapping intentions, delayed decisions, assumptions layered on assumptions, a system that worked when volume was low, now buckling under scale. Leadership reviewed the findings. The image was at risk, not because money was stolen, but because money was unmanaged, and unmanaged money erodes trust just as effectively as theft. The foundation prepared a response, carefully worded, technically accurate, strategically vague. It emphasized ongoing processes, future allocations, commitment to transparency. It did not include a full breakdown. That omission would matter, because the next request wouldn't ask politely, it would ask firmly. And when firmness enters the conversation, choice disappears. The money was supposed to go somewhere specific. Instead, it went into limbo. And limbo doesn't last forever. Sooner or later, someone turns on the lights. And when they do, every shadow becomes visible. What happened next wasn't a press leak. It wasn't an expose. It was an internal realization that the foundation no longer controlled the pace of this story. And once control slips, momentum becomes a liability. because the question is no longer where the money was supposed to go. It's who can explain where it's been. And that answer was about to be tested. How much money are we actually talking about? That was the question no one wanted to answer out loud. Because once a number enters the conversation, ambiguity becomes measurable. And measurable problems don't stay theoretical for long. At first, no one used a figure. Conversations danced around phrases like a portion, a subset, a significant amount. Those phrases create distance. They soften reality. They allow people to disagree without confronting facts. But numbers don't care about comfort. They sit there, waiting. The compliance specialist didn't intend to turn uncertainty into a headline. They were doing what they'd always done, reconciling accounts, matching flows, checking classifications. This time, instead of reviewing individual transactions, they pulled a cumulative report. That decision changed everything, because when you stop looking at trees and start looking at the forest, patterns emerge that can't be unseen. The temporary category, the one that was supposed to be transitional, had accumulated far more than anyone expected. Not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, millions. The exact figure fluctuated depending on timing, reclassifications, and pending distributions. But the range was undeniable. 7 figures, then 8. That's when the phrase around 8 million quietly entered internal conversations. Quietly because saying it loudly felt dangerous. 8 million. Once a number like that becomes real, the story stops being about processes and starts being about perception. 8 million sitting in limbo invites interpretation. And interpretation, once external, can't be controlled. The finance team began reconstructing timelines. They traced inflows, outflows, partial allocations, reimbursements. The money wasn't gone, but it wasn't clearly placed. It existed in a gray zone created by speed, optimism, and deferred decisions. The most unsettling realization wasn't the amount, it was how easily it happened. No one had flipped a switch and decided to park millions indefinitely. It accumulated gradually, transaction by transaction, justified each time by reasonable explanations, until reasonableness added up to exposure. Leadership asked the obvious question, can we fix this? The answer was complicated. Technically, yes, funds could still be allocated, reports could be updated, corrections could be made, but fixes don't erase history, they highlight it. Once you correct $8 million worth of ambiguity, you invite scrutiny into why correction was needed at all. And scrutiny brings outsiders. Outsiders don't accept internal logic. They demand documentation. Leadership debated strategy. Option 1, proactive disclosure. Acknowledge delays. Explain growth challenges. Commit to reforms. Option 2, quiet correction. Allocate funds swiftly. Update internal records. Hope the issue resolves without attention. The foundation chose the second option, not because they were hiding something, but because they feared misunderstanding. Fear often masquerades as pragmatism. The finance team moved quickly. They prepared reallocation plans, identified partner organizations, drafted transfer schedules. But haste introduces risk, and risk introduces mistakes. As transfers began, the compliance specialist noticed a new problem. Some of the funds had donor-specific restrictions that no longer aligned cleanly with proposed allocations. Untangling those restrictions would take time they no longer had. The number had already been referenced externally, not publicly, procedurally. A follow-up request arrived. This one referenced cumulative balances. Someone outside the organization had done the math. That's when urgency turned into anxiety. Meetings multiplied, legal counsel was consulted, language became cautious, precise, defensive. The foundation's leadership felt blindsided. How had this grown without triggering alarms sooner? The answer was uncomfortable, because alarms had been triggered. They just hadn't been loud enough to cut through confidence. The compliance specialist felt a shift in tone. Questions once welcomed were now scrutinized. Documentation requests felt tense. Not hostile, but wary. When people realize a problem might have consequences, they start worrying about narratives. Who knew what? When? Who approved which decision? Those questions change relationships. Suddenly, memory becomes selective. Conversations are reinterpreted. Emails are reread with new intent. The finance team prepared a comprehensive breakdown. It showed inflows totaling approximately 8 million passing through the temporary category over time. Some funds exited, many didn't. The report was honest and terrifying. Leadership reviewed it line by line. No fraud, no theft, no personal enrichment, just mismanagement. And mismanagement, in the eyes of regulators and donors, is not a small thing, because donors don't differentiate between malicious intent and negligent oversight. They care about trust. The foundation drafted a response to the external inquiry. This time, it included the number, carefully framed, contextualized, explained as transitional. But numbers have gravity. Once spoken, they pull everything else toward them. The response was acknowledged. Then came another request. More detail, more specificity, supporting documentation. This wasn't routine anymore. This was examination. Inside the foundation, morale dipped, staff whispered. Speculation spread. Was the foundation in trouble? Would this become public? Could this jeopardize everything they built? Leadership reassured the team. This is procedural. Procedural doesn't feel reassuring when $8 million are involved. The compliance specialist reviewed correspondence late into the night. They noticed something subtle but important. The tone of the requests had shifted, less open-ended, more directive. This signaled a transition from inquiry to assessment. And assessments lead to findings. The Foundation's legal counsel advised caution. They recommended thoroughness, transparency balanced with protection. That balance is fragile. Too much openness invites scrutiny. Too little invites suspicion. The Foundation tried to walk that line. But walking a line while carrying $8 million of uncertainty is exhausting. As the weeks passed, the story internally became less about the money and more about exposure. What would donors think? What would partners do? What would happen if this leaked? The irony was painful. The Foundation had built its brand on openness and impact. Now, openness felt risky. That contradiction weighed heavily. The compliance specialist submitted a final internal memo. It outlined risks, recommendations, next steps. They didn't accuse. They didn't dramatize. They concluded with one sentence. If this amount becomes the focus, control of the narrative will shift externally. That sentence lingered, because control was already slipping. The Foundation's leadership faced a realization they'd avoided. The issue wasn't whether the money could be accounted for eventually. It was whether the delay itself constituted a failure of governance. And governance failures don't require malicious intent to carry consequences. The $8 million had become a symbol, not of wrongdoing, but of vulnerability. And symbols attract attention. What happened next wasn't a press release. It wasn't a leak. It was a knock at the door of access. A request that went beyond documents. A request to review systems, processes, controls. Once that request arrived, the Foundation crossed a line it couldn't uncross. Because reviews don't ask whether you met well. They ask whether you did well. And that review would bring with it something far more dangerous than questions. It would bring interpretation. And interpretation would reshape everything. What happens when the story stops living in spreadsheets and starts living in sentences? Because numbers can be debated. Categories can be reclassified. Totals can be explained away with context and timing. But words, written words, carry intent, tone, awareness. And once words exist, they don't forget who wrote them or why. The first email didn't look dangerous. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It didn't accuse anyone of anything. It was polite. That's what made it lethal. The compliance specialist had sent a routine follow-up, asking for clarification on allocation timing related to the temporary category. They attached a chart. They included dates. They requested confirmation. The reply came from a senior manager within minutes. Let's avoid putting too much detail in writing until we're fully aligned. At the time, no one flagged that sentence. It felt practical, strategic, even protective, but reread later, it carried a different weight. Avoid detail in writing. That's not illegal, it's not even uncommon, but it's revealing because it suggests awareness that written records might be read by someone else one day. The compliance specialist didn't push back. They adjusted. They asked fewer questions in emails, more conversations moved to calls, meetings, side chats. The paper trail thinned. That wasn't intentional sabotage. It was adaptation. People respond to cues. And the cue was clear: be careful. As scrutiny increased, email tone across the organization shifted. Words became softer, more conditional, more vague. Phrases like, we believe, our understanding is, we anticipate, certainty disappeared. And certainty is what regulators look for. Here's the paradox. The more careful the language became, the more suspicious it looked when reviewed later, because clarity was replaced by caution. The foundation's leadership didn't instruct anyone to hide information. They didn't say, don't write this down. They didn't have to. Culture does that work on its own. When people sense risk, they self-edit. They choose words that protect rather than inform. They prioritize tone over truth. That's how emails become evidence without anyone intending them to be. The second email that mattered wasn't from leadership. It was from a mid-level staffer, someone tasked with reconciling partner reports, someone overwhelmed by volume and deadlines, someone trying to be helpful. They wrote, I'm still unclear how these funds are being classified at the moment. The guidance keeps changing. Changing, that word mattered, because changing guidance implies instability, and instability implies mismanagement. The email went unanswered, not ignored, just deferred. Deferred emails don't disappear. They sit, time-stamped, waiting. The compliance specialist followed up privately. They asked the staffer to forward any relevant correspondence. What came next was not one email, it was a thread. A long one. Messages spanning months. Different people. Different explanations. Different assurances. Each email alone was harmless. Together they told a story of uncertainty being managed through language rather than resolution. One email suggested allocations were imminent. Another implied approvals were pending. A third referenced leadership review. A fourth contradicted the third. No, one lied. They just didn't agree. And disagreement, documented, becomes a map of confusion. The compliance specialist compiled the thread. They didn't send it externally, they shared it internally, with a note, these explanations aren't aligning. That should have triggered a reset. Instead, it triggered defensiveness. Not anger, not denial, concern. Leadership recognized the risk instantly. Not because the emails proved wrongdoing, they didn't, but because they proved awareness of inconsistency. Awareness is the dividing line between accident and accountability. And accountability is where consequences live. Legal counsel reviewed the thread. They highlighted phrases, circled timestamps, asked who had approved which statements. This was the moment when people began to understand that emails don't just communicate, they memorialize. A decision was made. Future communications about allocations would go through a single channel, one voice, one narrative. Consistency became the priority. That decision made sense. It also created a new problem, because consistency achieved after inconsistency draws attention to what came before. The compliance specialist noticed something else, a deletion request, an email asking whether certain drafts could be removed from shared folders to reduce confusion. That request wasn't fulfilled, but the request itself was logged. Deletion requests are red flags, not because deletion is illegal, but because it implies regret. And regret implies hindsight. Hindsight is dangerous because it suggests people now understand something they didn't understand before. And when did that understanding arrive? That question would matter later. The foundation's internal systems retained backups, drafts, autosaves, even messages that were never sent existed somewhere. The compliance specialists didn't go hunting for incriminating material, they followed procedure. They archived. Archiving feels passive, but archiving preserves history. As the external review escalated, requests for internal communications became more specific. They didn't ask for relevant emails, they asked for communications referencing specific categories, dates, and decisions. Someone outside the organization already knew what to look for. That realization sent a chill through leadership, because now the emails weren't just internal tools, they were external exhibits. Legal counsel advised full cooperation. Partial disclosure could worsen perception. The foundation began compiling records, inbox searches, keyword filters, date ranges. That's when the scale became apparent. Hundreds of emails, thousands. Not incriminating, but contradictory. And contradiction is combustible because contradictions invite interpretation. Why did this person say one thing in March and another in June? Why did guidance shift without documentation? Why were concerns raised and not resolved? These aren't accusations, they're questions. And questions, once formalized, don't go away. The compliance specialist watched the process with a sinking feeling. This wasn't about catching someone doing something wrong. It was about revealing that no one had been steering clearly. Leadership held emergency meetings. They debated messaging, strategy, risk. Some argued the emails reflected growing pains. Others worried they reflected deeper governance flaws. Both could be true, but truth is rarely what shapes outcomes. Narrative does. And the narrative was slipping. One email in particular became a focal point. It was short, 4 sentences. Sent late at night, it read, "We need to be aligned before this gets examined externally. Let's pause detailed explanations until we've finalized our position." Pause detailed explanations. Until examined externally. Those words weren't criminal, but they were loaded because they implied anticipation of examination. Anticipation suggests awareness. Awareness changes everything. The sender didn't mean it that way. They meant coordination, preparation, prudence. Intent doesn't erase implication. An implication is what reviewers work with. As the emails were compiled, leadership began to see the story forming without their input. It wasn't a story of theft. It wasn't a story of fraud. It was a story of hesitation. And hesitation in governance reads like avoidance. The foundation prepared an explanatory memo to accompany the email release. It contextualized language, explained timelines, clarified roles. But explanations added after the fact never feel as strong as clarity shown in real time. The compliance specialist submitted everything requested. They did so calmly, professionally. They knew this wasn't about blame. It was about record. And record is unforgiving. As the external reviewers analyzed the emails, they identified patterns, repeated references to alignment, delays in written clarification, shifts from explicit to vague language. These patterns suggested something important. Not intent to deceive, but discomfort with scrutiny. Discomfort raises suspicion. The foundation's leadership was informed that further questions would follow, not about numbers, about communication, because communication reveals mindset. And mindset reveals culture. This was the turning point. Up until now, the foundation could argue the issue was technical, a systems problem, a growth issue. But emails showed something else. They showed that people knew things weren't clean and chose caution over clarity. That choice wouldn't automatically condemn anyone, but it would shape interpretation. And interpretation, once set, frames every subsequent answer. The compliance specialist closed their laptop late one night and realized something unsettling. The most damaging material wasn't the numbers, it wasn't the delays, it was the awareness captured in everyday language. Because awareness eliminates innocence, not legally, but narratively. And narrative is what this process now belonged to. The next request would not be for documents. It would be for people, interviews, statements, explanations. And once individuals are involved, pressure multiplies because people remember differently. They phrase differently, they protect differently. What came next would test not just the foundation's systems, but its people. And once people are questioned, stories diverge. What makes someone decide that staying silent is more dangerous than speaking up? That's the question everyone asks after the fact. When the story is already public, when the consequences are already clear, when hindsight makes bravery look inevitable. But bravery is never inevitable in the moment. In the moment, it feels reckless, lonely, potentially career-ending. And the person who would later be labeled the whistleblower didn't wake up one morning eager to expose anything. They didn't see themselves as heroic. They didn't see themselves as rebellious. They saw themselves as stuck. Stuck between documentation and denial, between procedure and pressure, between what was written down and what was being said out loud. For months, they'd watched the foundation bend itself into careful shapes, not breaking, just bending, adjusting language, shifting explanations, postponing clarity. At first, they told themselves it wasn't their place. Every organization has messes. Every growing institution stumbles. Who were they to disrupt something that at its core was trying to do good? That question haunted them because it came with a follow-up they couldn't ignore. What if trying to do good wasn't enough anymore? The whistleblower wasn't a senior executive. They weren't a public face. They didn't have power in the traditional sense. What they had was proximity. They saw how the emails changed. They saw how meetings stopped including certain people. They saw how answers became circular. They also saw the toll it took on staff. People were anxious, quiet, second-guessing themselves, afraid of asking the wrong question in the wrong way at the wrong time. The whistleblower started keeping notes, not dramatic notes, not accusations, just observations, dates, who said what didn't line up. At first, the notes were for their own sanity, a way to make sense of contradictions. But as scrutiny increased, those notes began to feel heavier, because they told a story no one else was acknowledging. The turning point came during a meeting that wasn't supposed to be significant. A routine check-in, leadership present, legal counsel dialed in. Someone asked a question about the temporary category, carefully phrased, neutral. The answer was confident. Too confident. It contradicted something the whistleblower knew to be false, not maliciously false, but factually incorrect. The room moved on. No one corrected it. That moment lingered, because silence in that context felt like consent. The whistleblower replayed the meeting in their head for days. Had they misunderstood? Was there an update they'd missed? Were they wrong? They checked the records. They weren't wrong. That realization was isolating, because once you know something others are ignoring, you become responsible for it, whether you want to or not. The whistleblower approached a colleague they trusted, carefully, casually. "Does this make sense to you?" The colleague hesitated, then shrugged. "It's complicated." Complicated had become the catch-all phrase, the shield, the excuse. The whistleblower went home that night feeling something shift. This wasn't about complexity anymore. It was about avoidance. Over the next few weeks, the pressure intensified. External requests increased. Internal messaging tightened. People were told to route questions through specific channels, to avoid speculation, to stay aligned. Alignment sounded reasonable, but alignment without resolution felt like choreography. The whistleblower noticed something else. Certain people stopped being copied on emails. Meetings became smaller, decisions more centralized, information narrowed. That's when fear crept in. Not fear of punishment, fear of being used as a buffer, because in moments like this, organizations often look for someone to absorb impact, someone low enough to be expendable, high enough to be informed. The whistleblower didn't want to be that person. They reviewed their notes again. They reviewed the emails. They reviewed the reports. What they saw wasn't a conspiracy. It was fragmentation. And fragmentation, when examined externally, can look like concealment. The whistleblower faced a choice. Do nothing and hope leadership regains control, or speak and lose control entirely. Neither option felt safe, but one felt honest. They reached out to the compliance specialist, not with accusations, with questions. What happens if this gets worse? The compliance specialist didn't answer immediately. When they did, the reply was, "Careful, it already is." That sentence carried weight, because it confirmed what the whistleblower had been sensing. This wasn't about preventing a problem anymore. It was about managing consequences. The whistleblower asked what documentation existed. The compliance specialist explained. Records, emails, memos, reports. Enough to reconstruct a timeline. Enough to show awareness. Enough to show delay. The whistleblower felt sick because they realized something important. If this unfolded publicly, the narrative would not be nuanced, it would not distinguish between intent and outcome. It would simplify, and simplification is brutal. The whistleblower asked the question they'd been avoiding. What happens if someone outside asks me directly? The compliance specialist paused, then answered honestly. You tell the truth. Truth. Such a small word for something that could destroy careers. The whistleblower spent sleepless nights imagining scenarios. An interview, a formal statement, a deposition. They imagined being painted as disloyal, bitter, opportunistic. They imagined losing their job. They imagined staying silent and watching others be blamed. That last image broke something because the whistleblower had seen how blame travels. It doesn't go upward. It doesn't land on structures. It finds individuals, often the least protected ones. The whistleblower didn't want to be a shield. They wanted the story to be accurate, so they made a decision. They wouldn't leak. They wouldn't dramatize. They wouldn't run to the media. They would respond honestly if asked, and they would preserve evidence. That meant securing copies of their notes, ensuring emails weren't lost, making sure records survived internal chaos. Preservation isn't betrayal. It's insurance. Days later, the request came. Not dramatic, not accusatory. An invitation to provide context. The whistleblower sat in a neutral room with neutral faces. They were asked open-ended questions. How did processes work? When did you notice issues? Who raised concerns? The whistleblower answered carefully. They didn't speculate. They didn't accuse. They stuck to facts. But facts have implications, and those implications rippled outward. The interview lasted hours. When it ended, the whistleblower felt hollow. They hadn't said anything explosive, but they'd said enough. Because they'd confirmed awareness, they'd confirmed delays, they'd confirmed internal disagreement. And those confirmations shifted the story. The foundation was no longer dealing with abstract governance issues. It was dealing with human testimony. Testimony introduces credibility. Credibility attracts attention. After the interview, internal dynamics changed again. People became quieter, politer, distant. The whistleblower sensed suspicion, not overt, but palpable. Were they the source? Had they said too much? Could they be trusted? Trust, once fractured, doesn't heal easily. The whistleblower wasn't punished. They weren't praised. They were sidelined, removed from meetings, excluded from updates, left in limbo. That limbo was its own punishment, because uncertainty is exhausting. Meanwhile, the review intensified. More interviews, more document requests. The whistleblower heard rumors, names, timelines, speculation. They tried not to listen. They focused on one thing. They had told the truth. But truth has momentum, and momentum doesn't stop with one voice. Others were interviewed, some corroborated, some contradicted. Memories diverged. Language differed, and those differences created fault lines. The whistleblower realized something unsettling. By speaking, they hadn't just changed their own fate, they'd triggered a chain reaction. Because once one person breaks silence, silence loses its power. People start remembering differently. They start reinterpreting moments they'd dismissed. They start asking themselves whether they should have spoken sooner. That's how stories accelerate. Not through scandal, through reflection. The whistleblower didn't feel triumphant. They felt exposed. Because now, whatever happened next would define them. Hero, traitor, footnote. Labels would come later. For now, they waited. And while they waited, something unexpected happened. Another person spoke. Not publicly, internally. They referenced the whistleblower's testimony indirectly. They added details. They filled gaps. That second voice changed the tone entirely. Because corroboration transforms concern into pattern. And patterns demand escalation. The whistleblower wasn't informed directly. They found out through silence, through meetings canceled, through schedules shifted, through the sudden presence of people they didn't recognize. The review had entered a new phase, one that no longer asked whether there was a problem, but how far it extended. And once that question is asked, there's no way back to reassurance, because reassurance assumes control. Control had been lost. The whistleblower sat alone at their desk one evening and realized something that would stay with them forever. Speaking hadn't ended the story. It had only moved it to a stage where outcomes were no longer negotiable. Whatever happened next would be decided elsewhere, by people who didn't care about intentions, only evidence. And evidence was accumulating. The whistleblower closed their laptop, knowing that the next chapter of this story wouldn't be about them, it would be about systems. And systems, once exposed, reveal everything. What happens when the rules you've been quietly managing suddenly take control of the story? Because compliance is supposed to be invisible, background noise, a framework that supports the mission without ever competing with it. When compliance works, no one talks about it. When it doesn't, it becomes the only thing anyone can talk about. This was the moment when compliance stopped being a checklist and started becoming a clock, ticking. The foundation had always treated compliance as something steady, procedural, almost mechanical. Forms filed, deadlines tracked, reports submitted, a necessary rhythm beneath the more exciting work of impact and storytelling. Now that rhythm had been interrupted, and interruptions attract attention. The first sign that things had escalated came quietly, a calendar invite labeled Process Review, no agenda. External attendees included. The meeting length, 3 hours. 3 hours is never routine. Leadership entered that meeting prepared to explain delays, contextualize growth challenges, and reassure everyone involved that systems were being refined. They were not prepared for the tone. The questions weren't hostile. They weren't accusatory. They were clinical. Walk us through your controls. Who approves reallocations? What happens when a restriction conflicts with timing? How are exceptions documented? These questions didn't ask why the foundation existed. They asked how it operated. And that distinction mattered, because you can defend a mission emotionally. You can't defend a process emotionally. Processes either exist or they don't. As leadership spoke, they realized something unsettling. Their answers relied heavily on trust. Trust in people, trust in judgment, trust in intent. But compliance doesn't trust trust. It trusts documentation. And documentation was uneven. The reviewers asked for evidence of controls, not policies, not intentions. Proof that procedures were followed consistently. That's when the foundation felt the ground shift. Because policies existed, controls existed, but adherence wasn't always demonstrable. There were exceptions, workarounds, verbal approvals, decisions made in meetings that were never formally recorded. Each one felt reasonable at the time. Together, they formed a compliance gap. The reviewers didn't react dramatically. They took notes, asked follow-ups, requested samples. The meeting ended without conclusions. That silence was worse than confrontation, because silence implies evaluation. Inside the foundation, panic began to simmer. Not explode, simmer. Leadership gathered privately. They replayed the meeting, parsed questions, debated interpretations. Were the reviewers concerned or just thorough? Was this standard or escalated? Had the whistleblower's testimony shifted the process into a new category? No one knew for sure. And uncertainty is fertile ground for fear. The compliance specialist reviewed the foundation's filings again. They knew where the weaknesses were. They'd known for months. Now those weaknesses felt amplified. They prepared internal memos outlining gaps, recommendations, immediate corrective actions. Leadership approved some, others were deferred. Let's see how this plays out. That phrase landed die.